So, so, I got a really cool topic for you today on the Ton Does Linux podcast. I've been thinking a lot about all these expensive software programs people use, and I was wondering if we could talk about, the open source alternatives that are out there.
I've been working with open source software for years now, and there's just so much amazing stuff out there that people don't even know about. I'm really excited to share some of these alternatives that can, basically replace all those expensive programs people are using.
That's exactly what I was hoping to hear because, I keep seeing these crazy subscription prices for software and I'm like, shh, there's gotta be a better way, right?
There absolutely is. And the best part is, these aren't just cheap knockoffs. We're talking about really powerful, community-driven solutions that in some cases are actually better than the paid stuff. I can't wait to dive into all the options.
So, before we get into specific alternatives, could you maybe explain what exactly makes software open source? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so open source software is basically code that's, open to everyone. The source code, which is like the DNA of the program, is freely available for anyone to see, modify, and even share with others. You know what I mean? It's completely transparent.
But why would developers just give away their work like that?
That's actually one of the most beautiful things about open source. See, it's built on this idea of collaboration and community. Developers aren't really giving away their work. They're sharing it with a community that helps make it better. Think of it like a massive group project where everyone brings their expertise to the table.
So how does that actually work in, the real world?
So in practice, you've got these communities of developers all around the world working together. They're constantly reviewing each other's code, suggesting improvements, fixing bugs, and because everything's transparent, security issues get spotted and fixed really quickly. Plus, since there's no profit-driven company controlling everything, the focus stays on making the best possible software for users, not shareholders.
And, is this actually sustainable? How do these projects keep going?
That's a great point. See, open source projects survive through a mix of things. Some get donations from users, others have companies that support them because they use the software themselves. And then you've got organizations like Mozilla and the Linux Foundation that help fund development. The key thing is, the software itself stays free and open, even if some companies build business models around supporting it.
So, speaking of actual alternatives, what about Microsoft Office? I know a lot of people who basically live in those programs, you know what I mean?
Oh man, this is where LibreOffice really shines. It's basically the go-to alternative for Microsoft Office, and it's completely free and open source. You've got Writer instead of Word, Calc instead of Excel, Impress instead of PowerPoint. The whole package, really.
But can it actually handle all the stuff people normally do in Office? That's a pretty big ask.
So here's the thing. LibreOffice can handle pretty much everything most people throw at it. You've got all your basic formatting, styles, templates, but what's really cool is that it can work with Microsoft Office files too. You can open a Word document, edit it, and save it back in the same format.
But, is there a learning curve? Do you have to relearn everything?
The interface is actually pretty familiar if you've used Microsoft Office before. I mean, sure, some things are in slightly different places, but the basic principles are the same. You've got your toolbar at the top, your formatting options, and honestly, some things are even better in LibreOffice.
Like what? What sort of things are we talking about?
Well, for one, LibreOffice has this amazing built-in PDF editor, something you'd usually need to pay extra for with other software. And get this, it's got better stability when working with large documents, because it doesn't load everything into memory at once. Plus, the default file format is based on open standards, so you'll never get locked out of your own documents.
What about all those fancy features people use at work, like macros and stuff?
See, that's another area where LibreOffice really delivers. It's got its own macro system, supports VBA scripts to some extent, and even has this cool feature called Basic for automation. And because it's open source, There's this whole community creating extensions and templates that you can just download and use.
So what about photo editing? Like, everyone knows Photoshop, right? But that subscription model is getting pretty expensive.
Oh man, this is where Gimp comes in. That's the GNU image manipulation program. It's this incredible piece of open source software that's been around for ages, and it's absolutely free. Like, completely free, no subscription, no hidden costs.
But can it actually do the stuff that, that Photoshop does? Because that's pretty advanced software.
So here's the thing. Gimp has got most of the features that regular users need. You've got your layers, masks, filters, various selection tools, and it supports all the common file formats. The cool part is that it even handles Photoshop files, so you can work with .psd files directly.
I've heard some people say the interface is, kind of different though.
That's a fair point. The interface is definitely its own thing. But what's really interesting is that recent versions have made huge improvements. You've got this single window mode now that feels much more modern, customizable toolbars, and you can even arrange things to feel more familiar if you're coming from Photoshop.
So, what kind of stuff can you actually do with it?
Pretty much all your standard photo editing tasks. You can do basic stuff like cropping, resizing, color correction, but also more advanced things like working with layers, creating complex compositions, digital painting. And there's this whole ecosystem of plugins that add even more functionality. Some of them are actually pretty amazing for things like photo retouching or creating special effects.
But is it good enough for professional work?
You know what's interesting about that? I've seen some incredible work done with Gimp. Professional photographers, digital artists, even some design studios are using it. The thing is, while it might not have some of the really specialized tools that Photoshop has, it's got everything you need for about 90% of typical image editing tasks. And because it's open source, it's constantly being improved by developers who actually use it.
So we've talked about Office stuff and photo editing, but the biggest piece of software everyone uses is, the operating system itself. What's the deal with Linux? I mean, isn't it super complicated?
Actually, that's a common misconception that I love clearing up. Linux has come such a long way, especially for beginners. These days, distributions like Ubuntu or Linux Mint are just as user-friendly as Windows, if not more so. They've got these beautiful, intuitive interfaces that just work straight out of the box.
But what exactly is a distribution? I hear that term thrown around a lot.
So think of it this way. A Linux distribution, or distro for short, is basically a complete package of the Linux operating system that comes with all the software you need to get started. It's like, you know how Windows comes with certain programs pre-installed? Same concept, but you get way more choice in how everything looks and works.
So which one would you recommend for someone who's never used Linux before?
For complete beginners, I always point people towards Linux Mint. It's got this really familiar feel to it, especially if you're coming from Windows. The desktop layout, the way you access programs, even the system settings. Everything's right where you'd expect it to be. Plus, it comes with all these useful programs already installed.
But what about, running my existing programs? That's always been my biggest concern.
Right, so here's the really cool part. Most popular software these days either has native Linux versions or really good alternatives. We've already talked about LibreOffice and Gimp, right? And for other Windows programs, there's this tool called Wine that lets you run them directly on Linux. Plus, gaming on Linux has gotten incredibly good, especially with Steam's Proton system.
So, what's the actual process of switching like?
The best part is you don't have to commit right away. You can actually try Linux Mint or Ubuntu by running it directly from a USB drive. No installation needed. This way, you can test everything, make sure your hardware works, and get comfortable with it before making any changes. And when you do decide to install it, the process is pretty straightforward. Basically, just clicking next a few times.
Speaking of alternatives, I've been meaning to ask about media players and stuff. You know how everyone just uses Windows Media Player or whatever comes with their computer? Are there, good open source options for that?
Oh man, this is one of my favorite topics. VLC Media Player is probably the king of open source media players, and it's just incredible. It plays literally everything you throw at it. Videos, music, DVDs, streams, you name it. The best part is it doesn't need any extra codecs or plugins, everything's built right in.
Wait, so it just works with everything? Like, no pop-up saying, you need to download this thing to play that file?
Exactly. That's what makes it so fantastic. And it's super lightweight too. No bloatware, no ads, just pure functionality. You can even use it to convert files between different formats, stream media from the internet, or play damaged files that other players can't handle.
That's actually pretty cool. What about, like, audio editing and stuff? I've been thinking about maybe starting a podcast.
So for audio work, Audacity is absolutely brilliant. It's this really powerful audio editor that can do pretty much everything the expensive programs can do. You can record multiple tracks, edit them, add effects, clean up background noise. It's what a lot of podcasters use, actually.
Is it complicated to use? Because some of these professional audio tools look pretty intimidating.
Not at all. That's what makes Audacity so special. The interface is pretty straightforward, and there are tons of tutorials online. Plus, it's got all these built-in tools that make it perfect for podcast editing. Noise reduction, compression, normalization. These are things that would cost you hundreds of dollars in professional software.
What about other creative stuff, like for making music or something?
Oh, you've got some amazing options there too. LMMS is fantastic for music production. It's like an open source alternative to FL Studio. And if you're into 3D animation, Blender is absolutely incredible. It's been used to make actual movies and commercials. These tools really show how powerful open source software can be.
So, I'm really curious about something. Like, what are the actual benefits of switching to all these open source alternatives? You know, beyond just saving money?
The benefits are absolutely massive, and saving money is just the start. First off, you've got complete control over your software. No forced updates, no surprise changes to the interface, no features suddenly going behind a paywall. The software works for you, not the other way around.
What do you mean by having control exactly?
Well, with open source software, you can actually see all the code that makes it work. Now, I know most people aren't going to dive into the code themselves, but this transparency means that the community can verify there's no sketchy stuff happening in the background, no secret data collection, no hidden trackers, nothing.
Oh, that's actually really important these days.
Exactly. And there's something else that's really cool about open source software. It tends to be way more stable and secure because you've got this whole community of developers constantly reviewing and improving the code. Bugs get fixed super quickly. Security issues get patched right away.
But, what about actually making the switch? Like, where do you even start?
So here's what I always tell people. Start with one piece of software at a time. Don't try to change everything at once. Maybe begin with something simple like VLC or LibreOffice. Get comfortable with it, learn how it works. The interfaces might be a bit different at first, but they're usually pretty intuitive.
And what if someone gets stuck or needs help?
That's where the community comes in, and it's honestly one of the best parts of open source. There are these amazing communities around every major open source project. Forums, wikis, chat groups. You can find help for pretty much any problem you run into. And because everyone's there voluntarily, people tend to be super helpful and passionate about sharing their knowledge.
Is there anything people should, like, watch out for when they're making the switch?
Just be patient with yourself. The biggest mistake people make is expecting everything to work exactly like their old software. It's kind of like learning to drive a different car. The basics are the same, but some things might be in different places. Give yourself time to adjust, and don't be afraid to use online tutorials and documentation.
You know what? After everything we've talked about today, I'm actually getting pretty excited about trying some of these alternatives myself.
That's awesome to hear. And that's really what it's all about. Just giving these tools a chance. The open source world has come such a long way, And there's literally an alternative for almost everything now.
So, if you had to give like one final piece of advice to our listeners, what would it be?
Look, the best thing you can do is just dive in. Start small, maybe with VLC or LibreOffice like we discussed. The amazing thing about open source is that there's no risk. It's free, it's safe, and you can always go back if something doesn't work for you. But I'm pretty confident that once you see what these tools can do, you'll wonder why you didn't make the switch sooner.
And where can people learn more about all this stuff we talked about today?
Right. So if you're interested in learning more, there are a ton of resources and guides online. And remember, the open source community is incredibly welcoming. There's always someone ready to help you out.
Thanks so much for breaking all this down today. This has been, super informative.
Always a pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, remember, the future of software is open and it's already here. Why not be part of it?